So in previous lectures, we saw that how to create a component using the create class method provided by React.js. Now, this component that we created has got a life cycle, and this life cycle has got certain states which we will be exploring now in this tutorial. So let's get started with component, state, and life cycle. So we'll be first of all seeing these methods that can be used inside a component. The first one is a very common one that we have been using till now, and that's called render method. So over here, if you take a look at the render function that we have, you can see that it only returns one element. So over here you can either return a div. That div can have child elements, but it will only return one element. So you cannot have multiple paragraph tags returned by the render function. Also, if you do not want to return anything at all, you can simply write null or false to indicate that you don't want anything rendered behind the scenes. The render function should not modify component state. It should always return the same result each time it's invoked, and it does not read from or write to the document object model. Now, in case you need to interact with the browser, you need to perform your work in methods which we'll be exploring later in this tutorial, like component did mount or other lifecycle methods instead. Keeping render pure in this way makes server rendering more practical and makes components easier to think about. Now, next in line is the getInitialState method. Now, whenever this one is invoked, once before the component is mounted, the return value will be used as the initial value of this .state property. Then we have getDefaultProperties. Now this one is invoked once and cached when the class is created. This method is invoked before any instances are created and thus cannot rely on this .props. In addition, please be aware that any complex objects returned by getDefaultProps will be shared across instances, not copied. Then we have prop types. Now the prop types object allows you to validate props being passed to your components. We'll be exploring more on this when we'll be having reusable components. Then we have mixins. Now mixins array allows you to use mixins to share behavior among multiple components. This will also be part of reusable components, so there we'll be exploring prop types and mixins in greater detail. After that, we have statics. The statics object allows you to define static methods that can be called on the component class. So we have the statics method over here, and you can see that we are just defining a method inside it and passing a parameter called test, and it's returning true if its value is set to high. Now methods defined within this block, so the block that we have with the curly braces, within this block are static, and that means that you can run them before any component instances are created, and the methods do not have access to the props or state of your components. Now if you want to check the value of props in a static method, have the caller pass in the property as an argument to the static method. So in that case, the property will be passed over here as an argument to this particular method. Then we have display name. The display name string is used in debugging messages, and usually the JavaScript XML, that is JSX, sets this value automatically. Now we'll see the lifecycle methods and the states through which a component goes. The first one is the mount state. Now in mount state we have a couple of methods like component will mount and component did mount. Now component will mount is invoked once both on the client and server. Now immediately before the initial rendering occurs, if you call set state within this method, render will see the updated state and will be executed only once despite the state change. The next one is component did mount. Now this one is invoked once only on the client, not on the server, immediately after the initial rendering occurs. At this point in the lifecycle, the component has a DOM representation which you can access via react.findDOMNode method. If you want to integrate with other JavaScript frameworks, set timers using setTimeout or setInterval or send AJAX requests, perform those operations in this method. So as soon as the component is mounted, we can do our stuff inside that method. Then we have the update state. Now update state has got component will receive properties, should component update, component will update, and component did update methods. So component will receive props is invoked when a component is receiving new properties. Now this method is not called for the initial render. We can use this as an opportunity to react to a property transition before a render is called by updating the state using this dot set state. The old properties can be accessed via this dot props. Calling this dot set state within this function will not trigger an additional render. Then we have should component update. This one is invoked before rendering when new properties or state are being received. This method is not called for the initial render or when force update is used. We can use this as an opportunity to return false when you are certain that the transition to the new props and state will not require a component update. If should component update returns false, then render will be completely skipped until the next state change. In addition, component will update and component did update will not be called as well. By default, should component update always returns true to prevent subtle bugs and state is mutated in place. But if you are careful to always treat state as immutable and to read only from properties and state in render, then you can override should component update with an implementation that compares the old properties and state to their replacements. Next in line is component will update. Now this one is invoked immediately before rendering when new properties or state are being received. This method is not called for the initial render. After that we have component did update, and this one is invoked immediately after the component's updates are flushed to the document object model. This method is not called for the initial render. We can use this method to operate on the document object model when the component has been updated. Then the next state is unmount, and the method that it has is component will unmount. Now this one is invoked immediately before a component is unmounted from the document object model. We can perform any necessary cleanup in this method, or you can say garbage collection, such as invalidating timers or clearing up any document object model elements that were created in component did mount. So this was all about the component state and lifecycle, the methods that we can have inside a component and different states that it goes through and the methods that each states have. And once we are through this, it will be very easy for us to understand the upcoming sections that we'll be having.